We move over now to Chapter 12, Advertising and Public Relations. Those are important components in the whole world of mass media and society. In Chapter 12, an overview of advertising and then an overview of public relations, dealing with a bit of the history of advertising and PR, and of course, the operations and procedures of advertising and PR in our society, and advertising and PR in our modern digital age. There's a shifting role of advertising and branding. Today, brands are increasingly publishers. They don't just buy advertising on media outlets. GE is a good example of that in the recent years as a company that has succeeded with a model of being a publisher of their brand. And so in the imaging of the content of GE published content around different pillars for its different business units. GE is a very diverse company, and it has healthcare, energy, aviation, finance, and so forth. And they were able to publish their entire company's profile within this holistic macro view, everything aligned to its brand purpose, even though the company is telling stories through a mix of videos, data visualization, social media, infographics, and all other forms of media communication. There is some criticism of branding today, and so there'll be links on the outlines kind of pointing you toward these if you'd like to look further into it, such as the No Logo documentary and the greatest movie ever sold. And with the way that we get a high profile of companies, we also find that there's been some backlash of corporations, and our chapter talks about companies like Nike and Starbucks as some examples of that. So what is advertising then? It is promoting a product or service through the use of paid announcements. Advertising rose in the late 1800s and gained stature through the 20th century, but early in the 20th century, advertising still had very much a bad kind of impression for people. And part of that was the way that advertising has been done through the years in the way of exaggerating claims. And so people push back against the way advertising accomplishes its purposes. But we see in Chapter 12 that World War I was an advertising and propaganda boom. Product endorsements from celebrities arose in the 1920s. And again, within all of this, you have to recognize going back in the 1800s, what was kind of always used as an example was the idea of selling snake oil, that quite often ads were promoting products that had dubious types of benefits. A consumer movement ultimately led to false advertising becoming more and more of an issue, and ultimately the development of the Federal Trade Commission and individual states also putting laws into place to try to have some regulatory control over advertising. What about television and advertising? Well, corporations started sponsoring TV shows as television emerged in the 1950s, and eventually TV networks produced shows funded by ads from multiple companies, even though originally those had been individual sponsorship. We can look back at the 1980s and recognize MTV and its influence when all it did was play music videos, and MTV brought music video approach to the way advertising was developed for television. Just one of those examples of the variety of ways that advertising on TV has evolved through the years. In terms of some backlash, where do the Nike shoes get made? Well, some people started recognizing that some of these high-profile companies might have had bad situations in the manufacturing overseas, and so that's where we think about what are called the sweatshop protests. Anti-corporation protests have targeted companies like Nike and Starbucks, often as kind of symbols of capitalism. There is always that sense of, is there truth to the advertising? And you can probably think of some examples today of things you may see on television or in an advertising message otherwise, and really say, is that possible? Is that true? Well, we recognize what's called puffery, which is kind of just exaggeration about an idea that really is accepted versus what is truly false advertising. If I have a restaurant and my big sign out front says the best chicken fried steak in Texas, well, that's considered to be puffery because it's not provable or unprovable. Advertising of unhealthy products has also been a target of people's attention, and that would be in the idea of things that are bad for us that still get advertised and promoted to us, such as things like soft drinks and fast food and tobacco. What types of advertising are there? Well, in the general sense, we can think about direct mail, billboards, radio ads, newspaper ads, TV commercials as some of the traditional type. And then, of course, these days we try to get viral advertising going through the internet. And then, of course, we have people's smartphones that we can use as a vehicle for advertising and all kinds of things through social media. P.T. Barnum was talked about early in our book and comes up again here because Barnum learned the effectiveness of using the media to gain attention. And one example is his Fiji mermaid, which was actually a mummified monkey and a fish sewn together. It's not necessarily interesting because viewers thought the creation was really a mermaid, but because they weren't sure if it was or not. And such marketing tactics brought Barnum shows out of his establishments and into social conversations and newspapers. So he learned in the 1800s how to do stunts and how to do marketing and promotion and advertising to get attention to his business. Companies today might avoid that style, but many have used the media and a similar sense of mystery to promote their products. So in terms of regulation, the Federal Trade Commission was established in 1914. In 1938, they were granted expanded power to protect consumers from misleading advertising. And within regulation, of course, the consumer movement in general is considered to be a form of regulating the way that people do their advertising. We look at things in terms of deceptive advertising of regulation, of advertising of controlling deceptive advertising. False advertising may lead to cease and desist orders, could force the companies to have to do corrective advertising. They might have to do an apology and an acknowledgement. So the Federal Trade Commission has levels of powers to bring actions against companies for things that they do. And FTC has other kinds of areas of regulation, such as they have guidelines about what you can do with endorsements or testimonials. So the Federal Trade Commission, of course, then is a federal government agency, but individual states. The Attorney General in Texas also has a pretty good power for regulating some false and deceptive and other levels of advertising within the state. What about cultural influence of advertising? Well, does it play a role in our lifestyle? Does it define what's good or bad or what we ought to do? Is it a way that really encourages consumerism? Is it something that defines products in terms of new cultural trends? Could we think that latest fashionable kind of a thing? You know, we didn't have coffee shops all over the US until Starbucks recognized that maybe that's something that would work quite well. We do know that stereotypes come about from the way people are portrayed in advertising and other forms of media. And so, of course, such as women, minorities, and any other kind of category, any group of people could have stereotypes portrayed in the way that advertising covers them. So, you know, some negative things in the sense of the cultural influence, but also there is an assumption that there are some levels of positive effects as a result of what advertising is in our society. So what about public relations then? Where advertising is the paid use of media space to sell something, public relations is the attempt to establish and maintain good relations between an organization and its constituents. So practically PR campaigns strive to use the free press to encourage favorable coverage for their particular company or their client. Our chapter talks about 4 public relations models: traditional publicity, public information, persuasive communication that's also called the two-way asymmetric, and then the 4th model is the two-way symmetric style. So read more about those in chapter 12. What about the functions of PR? Well, it may be media relations, it may be internal communications, it may be B2B, business to business type of communication, and it may be public affairs. Those are some of the typical functions of PR. What do we do when we set up a campaign? Well, we do our initial research. We then develop a strategy. We then look at the tactics we can use to accomplish that strategy, and then we evaluate the effectiveness of that particular campaign. So what about shifting from advertising to PR for companies? Well, the tobacco industry is a good example of that. Tobacco used to be advertised everywhere, and then there were regulations put into place to stop tobacco from being advertised in broadcast, for example. And so we've had decades now of transition from the tobacco industry surviving and now having to depend on different levels of marketing and PR campaigns in order to still get attention. As much as we would acknowledge kind of the dangers of tobacco, it still is a legal business and they still need to sell their product to people and have to find ways to do that. Branding is a part of thinking about the whole world of advertising and PR. And so branding has to do with the image of a company. And so companies also do what's called positioning, which is to make their product stand apart from similar products on the market. So two interrelated things that may be part of the world of advertising or public relations. Some successes in recent years in terms of particular campaigns. The Apple Think Different campaign is recognized as being very successful. Nike's Just Do It campaign, the Dos Equis campaign of the most interesting man. What about some failures? Well, our book talks about BP with an oil spill and gives us some details about what that did to their image and how they had to respond to that in the world of crisis communication. Our book doesn't talk about it, but around our region, we know about Bluebell ice cream and some issues they had with listeria in the ice cream and whether or not they handled the public relations properly in their response to that, where some people died and some people got sick and the product was off the market and then just brought back without very much real effort to apologize. So those are some of our major things then related to the overall idea of Chapter 12, helping us to appreciate the world of advertising and public relations. Let's look at a bit of review of some main ideas from Chapter 12. What is defined as promoting a product or service through the use of paid announcements? That is advertising. In 1843, a salesman by what name founded the first U.S. advertising agency. That was in Philadelphia. The agency made money by linking potential advertisers with newspapers, and so the start of advertising agencies came from Volney Palmer. Just as Benjamin Day discovered with selling newspapers for a penny, Chapter 12 tells us about the magazine chapter, refers back to that chapter that we've skipped, but it talks about the particular magazine's success in 1893, thanks to an advertising model, selling their issues for nearly half the price of other magazines, and depending on the money coming in from advertising, and that was McClure's magazine. Well, there's no Amazon for shopping in the 1800s, so during that late 1800s time period, nationwide department stores like Sears, Roebuck and Company and Montgomery Ward sold many of the same items to consumers all over the country thanks to mail order catalogs. Advertising in the early 20th century was still regarded by many as an unseemly occupation, but the attitude began to change as what? Widely considered a highbrow medium, began using more advertising. The advertising profession began attracting more artists and writers. And that was thanks to magazines. Represented by Volkswagen's ads against mainstream conformity and placing it strongly on the side of the consumer, the period of the 1950s and 60s, and advertising became known as what? For its emphasis on creativity over straight salesmanship. So we talk about the creative revolution in advertising from the mid to late 50s up through the 60s. Chapter 12 says during the late 1980s, studies showed that consumers were trending away from brands and brand loyalty, and that resulted in the rise of what? They focused on low brands rather than expensive name brands, and that's the big box stores such as Walmart. Although print ads have been around for centuries, Chapter 12 says what has hit newspaper advertising hard. A 45% drop in ad revenue between 2007 and 2010 signaled a catastrophic decline for the newspaper industry, and that, of course, has continued to evolve across the past 10 years, and that's the impact of the internet. What is an important aspect of TV advertising because it incorporates products into the plots of shows. It's been around since the 1890s when the Lumiere brothers first placed Lever soap in their movies. Chapter 12 says its big boom began with the reality TV show Survivor in 2000, and that is about product placement. New advertising techniques have become popular on the internet. Advertisers have tried to capitalize on the shared media phenomenon by creating what are called what? That achieve spontaneous success online, but they do say that 1 in 6 ads of this type actually fail or only successful, and that's what we call viral ads. 1971, the FTC began what? To force advertisers to provide evidence for the claims in their advertisements. Under this program, the FTC gained the power to issue cease and desist orders to advertisers regarding specific ads in question and to order corrective advertising. They began the Advertising Substantiation Program. In recent years, the FTC has turned its attention to online advertising. And so, what was it that was passed to prohibit companies from obtaining the personal information of children who access websites or other online resources? That's the Children's Privacy Protection Act of 1998. Icons such as Aunt Jemima, the Cream of Wheat Chef, and Hiram Walker Butler, some of the most recognizable Black figures in U.S. culture, but also recognized for their problem in promulgating stereotypical images of African Americans. What are the four models of PR? Our book talks about traditional publicity, public information, persuasive communication, and the two-way symmetric model. Of those four models of PR, which one works to persuade a specific audience to adopt a certain behavior or point of view? That is the persuasive communication model, also known as the two-way asymmetric model. During what part of a PR campaign do PR professionals usually determine objectives focused on the desired goal of the campaign and formulate strategies to meet those objectives? That is during the strategy phase. What company's stunt of providing a target in the ocean for the space station Mir when it was set to crash land in the Pacific Ocean in 2001 and it gained global promotional benefit for that company? That was Taco Bell. Just as PR campaigns build brands, PR crises can damage them. For example, what massive events became a PR nightmare for BP, an oil company that had been using PR to rebrand itself as an environmentally friendly energy company? That was the Gulf of Mexico oil spill in 2010. So this chapter gives us an overall view of the history and impact of advertising and PR that, although have some interrelated functions, that would also bring in the idea of marketing that we're not discussing here, and that also has unique characteristics. So be sure to read through the chapter, see the key takeaways at the end, and that gives us now an overview of some of the major things of Chapter 12 on